William Stadiem is a best-selling author of many books including Marilyn Monroe Confidential, Lullaby and Goodnight, written with Vincent Bugliosi, and Don't Mind If I Do, a memoir of celebrity with George Hamilton, a New York Times bestseller upon publication this year. In addition to writing an Emmy-nominated episode of LA Law, he also wrote the screenplay for Franco Zeffirelli's production Young Toscanini, starring Elizabeth Taylor. And first of all, great to see you, and you have one of the best jobs in the world right now, and I want it. Tell us about it.
It's a lot of fun. I write whatever I find grossly interesting. If it takes me all around the world, I do. My book last year that just came out was called Everybody Eats There, and it was, in short, around the world in 80 meals.
Oh, fantastic.
And I went around the world to the best restaurants, the restaurants where the most famous and interesting people go over the years. And so it was an odyssey through classic places from London, Paris, Rome, Sydney, Hong Kong, San Francisco, LA, New York. It was a wonderful trip.
But what about jet lag?
When you're hungry enough, the jet lag fades away. You're thinking about the next magnificent meal you're going to have.
What's your favorite restaurant in the whole wide world?
That's a hard
I know,
question.
but if you were to say, okay, Mike, I'm going to give you a job and I'm going to send you to the best restaurant in the world to taste the food, drink the wine, and enjoy the ambience. Where?
Well, it would be hard to top a place like Al Moro in Rome. It's one of the oldest, most beautiful restaurants in Rome, full of all the most beautiful people in Rome. Rome has a lot of beautiful people. The actresses, from Sophia Loren to Berlusconi, they all go there. It's a little restaurant with 3 rooms, maybe 20 tables, and the most magnificent spaghetti alla vongole you'll eat in the world, the most wonderful roast potatoes with a roast baby lamb, fabulous homemade ice creams and sorbets. And it was Fellini's favorite restaurant. And that restaurant's a 3-ring circus with perfect food.
So how do you decide on your books? Is it what you want to do? Is it a whim, an idea?
Well, things come your way. I mean, some years ago, a publisher called me out of the blue. He wanted to do it. He was interested in doing a book on King Farouk of Egypt. Now, King Farouk of Egypt was a name that I knew as a kid as the most richest and most decadent man in the world in the 50s, but that's all I knew. But his publisher said he's the last king of Egypt and he's a king and nobody knows anything about him. And I said, I don't know anything about him. He said, well, you want to learn? And I said,
yes,
why not?
well, yes.
So I got to live in Egypt for a year and travel around the world, because I did the book like the movie Citizen Kane, where I found 5 of his mistresses at different phases of his life, and I traveled around the world and tracked these women down, and each woman told her story of her romance with the king. And with one woman in London who was a famous writer, another woman in Sweden who became a famous writer, an opera diva in Italy. They were all fascinating people. A woman who came, an American girl who had been Bob Hope's sidekick on his radio show, who married one of the richest counts in Europe and became the first American countess before Grace Kelly. So each woman had a great story, and I tracked her down and told her, but I would have never thought of doing that book on my own. So somebody came to me. George Hamilton, for example, his lawyer is a friend of mine, and he had just gotten George as a client. We were having dinner in Los Angeles, and he said, I've got this great new client. He took me shopping today. And I said, who? And he said, George Hamilton. I said, well, that's where you got these gorgeous clothes, because normally he didn't look that good. And I said, George Hamilton, I think there's a book in George Hamilton. I said, can I meet him? He said, sure, I'll put you in touch with him. So he told George I was going to call him, and we met. And I talked George into doing this book, and it was a big hit. The restaurant book is something new. I was been the restaurant critic here in LA at different magazines for many years, and I love to eat. And that's always been a fantasy about being a writer, is to go and eat, and to be treated for it, and to be paid for it. It's pretty amazing.
You have a great life. I'm just thinking just then, you travel the world writing about food, and then you travel the world interviewing mistresses.
It's not bad.
I mean,
it's
at the
not
moment,
bad.
there's every guy with his tongue hanging out thinking, I want this guy's life.
I paid my dues before I became a writer. I used to be a lawyer on Wall Street, and there I traveled the world proofreading, and I didn't meet any mistresses, and I didn't get much food.
So you're making up for lost time.
But I liked the world, and I said, how can I improve on this? And the only way you improve on it, I said, you have to be your own boss, and you have to do what you want to do. And so the law would send you around, but they you keep an account of all your minutes. You have to bill every 10 minutes, what are you doing with your time?
Mm-hmm.
And they're watching you like
Well,
a
that's
hawk.
a good lawyer.
Oh, yeah.
Keep that thing ticking over.
Yeah, that's right. But I just didn't find it much fun. I found it boring, but I liked the travel part.
Mm-hmm.
But I couldn't sing, and I couldn't dance, and I couldn't paint. I said, how can I be free but get to sort of live in the world and do interesting things? And I came up with writer. Don't ask me why. I never minded writing. When I was in school, people I would offer, if you introduce me to your sister, I'll write your term paper for you. So I'd make deals with people. I somehow had no problem. The blank page didn't frighten me. But I had no idea you could do it for a living. And
what about the formula for success? I mean, you obviously have that formula, or do you?
There's no formula. I mean, I think the only formula is to try to find a subject that you find fascinating and convey the fascination that you find to a reader. So you have to love it. And, obviously, if the subject takes you traveling and you get to meet interesting people, you're going to be energized by what you have seen. And if you're good at what you're doing, if you do a good job, you'll transmit that energy and excitement that you have to the page, and then the reader will take it away from that. So everybody wins.
From Wall Street, around the world, some of the greatest places on the planet, and you chose Hollywood.
Well,
Why?
Who wouldn't? In America, that's the dream. I grew up in a little town in eastern North Carolina, a little tobacco town. And Tobacco. And the fantasy in that little town, they had 2 movie theaters, and they changed the shows twice a week, and sometimes they'd have double feature. But that was it. That was your life. And you go to the movie and you escape. And so I always had a fantasy as a little boy of coming to Hollywood. I think all Americans do, because most Americans grow up in small towns, and this is our family. This was before TV was such a big deal and everything. You really lived, and now people live through TV, which is all made here in Hollywood too. So then you have the idea of eternal sunshine, and as young people you watch the Rose Parade in January where you're freezing wherever you are, and people are out in the sunshine. So the idea of living in Southern California is the American dream. And so I felt as soon as I could, I wanted to come and live out here. Again, like being a writer, I didn't think you could really do it, but I wanted to see it. And I came out here and really came out not expecting to live here. I met a guy who was trying to produce a play off Broadway in New York. So I traded my apartment on 79th Street in New York for his apartment in Westwood, and we both ended up staying in the other place. I never went back, he never went back.
Do you miss New York?
I'd love to go back to New York in the right time of year, in the fall or the spring. And the fall is a magical time, especially right before Christmas, with all the lights and the Christmas tree and Rockefeller Center and all. But living in Los Angeles, it's the easiest place on earth.
Do you miss being a lawyer at
No,
times?
I can say that categorically. I miss the security of being a lawyer. Being a writer is you're only as good as your last books. You're always got to be on your toes. Lawyer, if you behave yourself and you bill enough hours, you'll become a partner and you'll have tenure and you'll have a very secure life. It'll be a little too predictable for me. I like to live on the edge a little bit.
How has LA helped develop your career, living in Hollywood? I mean,
if you want to write a book about George Hamilton, it helps to live in Hollywood. If you want to write about Marilyn Monroe, it helps to be here. I did a book about Frank Sinatra and his valet, which was a big bestseller, and I'm writing the script for a movie now that's going to be directed by Brett Ratner, who did all the Rush Hour movies.
Yes.
He's a big Sinatra fan. He thinks he's the modern day Rat Pack. And, they've been talking to people like Chris Tucker to play the valet and Nick Cage to play Sinatra. But
wow, that'll be fantastic.
It's not set in stone, so we'll see who they end up with. But that's a project I only would have found by being here in Los Angeles. A friend of mine who had been Johnny Carson's lawyer had a golf house down in Palm Springs, and he met Sinatra's valet in Palm Springs. And he called me up one day and he said, I know you had a big success with Marilyn Monroe's Maid. That was a formula that worked. Servant to the Stars. That's a formula that, if done well, that always works. He said, you had a hit with Marilyn's Maid. What about Sinatra's valet? I said, bring him on. And he brought this fellow, George Jacobs, to meet me. And the guy was one of the coolest guys I've ever seen. He was wearing an ascot and he wore spats. He was dressed better than Sinatra.
Wow.
And the guy was just in the first few stories tell me, one was about Greta Garbo, another was Marlene Dietrich, and another was Judy Garland, and another was Marilyn Monroe. I mean, within the first 10 minutes, incredible stories that I hadn't heard anywhere else. I said, there's a book in that. But I would have only gotten that by living in LA. If I'd been in New York, that was unlikely to come my way.
You've done so much about the history of Hollywood. I mean, some great stars. I mean, you mentioned Frank Sinatra. There's Marilyn Monroe. The whole kit and caboodle. And you're living history now, because Hollywood is just, history. Yesterday's history.
Every day.
What's the difference, though, between the days of Marilyn Monroe and Frank Sinatra to now?
It's much more casual now. In those days of Marilyn Monroe, Grace Kelly, Cary Grant, if you just look at it, or even George Hamilton, they were dressed up and they did their hair, and it was a big deal. If you just go to restaurants in Hollywood, you can go to restaurants, any restaurant, and don't need even a jacket, much less a tie. And even in Paris or London, you can go anywhere. You go to a place like Cipriani in London or Joel Robuchon in Paris. There's these counter restaurants. It's very casual. The world has become a world of Brad Pitts and Angelina Jolies. They're the new stars, but they're in their sweats most of the time. And in the old days, these people, unless they were dressed to the nines, they wouldn't even show their faces in public. So I think the world has become much more casual, and glamour has vanished in that way. There's a sense of glamour has transmuted into a different kind of celebrity, but it's not the dress-up glamour of yore. I'm working on a book now which really tracks this. It's a book I'm doing about Harry Winston, who's the most famous jeweler in the world. And Harry Winston dressed all the great, bejeweled all the greatest stars, and the richest people in the world. But now they borrow jewels only to wear at the Academy Awards, and they don't buy them, they borrow them. And that's the only time you see stars in jewelry anymore. So it's just changed a lot.
Don't mind if I do. You mentioned glamour and star and that sort of stuff. George Hamilton is that. Tell us about George Hamilton. Tell us about the book.
George is the last of the old-fashioned Hollywood movie stars. He was one of, when he got to Hollywood in the late 50s, he was one of the last of the great MGM contract players. He had a contract. And soon after he got there, MGM hit the skids, and there was no more. I mean, there's still MGM, but the MGM of yore, of the Fred Astaire and the Clark Gable and the More Stars Than in Heaven, that vanished. And George was the last one. So he's a great artifact of the great Hollywood, and he bought into the glamour, and he still does. So when you see George today, he puts on the dog. He is always dressed up. He's driving the Bentley.
He looks $1 million, doesn't he?
He does. But he knows that's his act.
That's his trademark.
That's right. And that suntan and beautiful teeth and the beautiful clothes. But today's stars aren't like that. So I wanted to get George before, because he's the last of a breed.
And today, it's rocketed up to the top of the list for the New York Times bestseller.
Well, I got a wonderful review last week in the New York Times, and I think people are fascinated by George. It's big season for celebrities. There's a Robert Wagner book that came out. Tony Curtis did a book. Roger Moore did a book. Christopher Plummer, Robert Vaughn, the Man from U.N.C.L.E. Yeah. All these people are doing books. So the New York Times said my book with George was the best of the lot. So I was very proud of that.
What do we see next? Do we see, would you combine celebrity with travel with food? I mean, that'd be fantastic.
Well, look, most celebrities like to travel, and they all like to eat.
Yeah, of course they would.
They do. But what I'm working on now is the Harry Winston book, which is as glamorous as they come, and it's taken me all over the world because Harry Winston was global. I've spent 4 trips to Europe this summer. A lot of trips to Switzerland, where Harry Winston, and to Paris, where his main European offices were. I met 2 of his great salesmen who are now in their 80s. They were both billionaires off commissions of selling Harry Winston jewelry, because Harry Winston had some amazing clients, not just the movie stars. They were nothing compared to big clients were the Arabs. He sold to the Saudi royal family, and he sold to the Sultan of Brunei. And those were the clients of the 70s and 80s. And if you can sell to them, you're set. I mean, these salesmen made themselves almost $1 billion in commissions, because you see, if you're an Arab prince and you have a harem of 100 wives, you buy $1 million necklace for one, you've got to buy $1 million necklace for all of them, because it's equal time. You can't play favorites. So lucky Harry Winston, he sold to all of them.
That's amazing. What is amazing, from a small town, which is a tobacco growing town, to now, do you find your whole journey one surprising and just incredible?
Every day is a surprise, and it's a gift, and it's exciting to wake up each day in LA with the beautiful sun shining and get to meet such interesting people and get to eat wonderful food, or get to go on a plane and go to a wonderful place. So every day is good. But you got to start somewhere, and that's where, my hand was dealt to me in the tobacco fields of North Carolina. So, but you appreciate the world even more when you come from a small place like that.
And you're right, it does make you appreciate the good things that you have now. Advice for somebody wanting to write a book?
Get in touch with things that interest you. Only write about what you love and we all have interests. And if you're interested enough and you can communicate that interest to others, you can have a hit book.
Advice for somebody wanting to, heaven forbid at times, but get into a restaurant, open a restaurant. What's the formula?
That's one of the hard. Freshness. You be proud. A lot of restaurants in America are reheating operations. They take processed food. That's right.
Throw it in 60 seconds.
They get the bird's eye, they put it in its tray. That's the convenient stuff of America. But I think if you have an honest restaurant where you're getting the freshest thing, and it's love. If you cook with love and pride, you'll have a good restaurant. And if you can get a few celebrities in, that can't hurt. In Los Angeles, that's the key to success, is the patronage of celebrities. This is a celebrity town, and people like to go where the stars go. So if whatever you do can get the stars in the restaurant, you'll have a hit.
You're an amazing person. You've done so much in your life. If you had a crowd of 100 of your friends from the last 20, 30, 40 years, in one word only, how would you describe yourself to them? They want to know, who are you? What are you? What are you about?
I'm excited.
Exciting.
I'm excited, not exciting. I'm excited. Life excites me. People excite me. Places excite me. I have a lot of enthusiasm, and it's unbridled. So if I had one word to describe myself, I say I'm an excitable boy.
William, thank you very much. It was a real pleasure
to be here.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.